you say a goal is impossible, the disruptive question, it's impossible unless, right? We say something is impossible as a protection mechanism. It means that not only we won't even try it, but we won't even try to think about trying it. As soon as I ask you it's impossible unless, the mind is forced back into problem-solving mode. Because now I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you all the conditions, right? But those conditions are the conditions that if you could put them in place, can make the impossible possible. Right. And the same thing with decisions, right? It's an impossible decision. Why? Not because I can't make it, right? Think about the little kid. They're getting bullied. What do I do? Right? Do I fight back? Do I tell the teacher? Do I tell my parent? Do I just take it? What's the best decision?
Hi there. Welcome to the Fundication Show. I'm Julie Tallman. I'm here with Christian Sadler.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we have a really great episode for you today. If you're like me and you love business and personal development, we get to speak with one of the world's leading research scientists and theory of constraints experts. We're here with Dr. DrAlanBarnard, CEO of Goldratt Research Labs. Thank you for being here. We're really excited to have you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
We want to talk today about how decision-making drives your life, how to set and achieve massive goals, and how that rolls over into investing and real estate. Tell us a little bit about what's the basis that everybody needs to know about your constraints.
So in science, we call something a theory. If it provides you with a very simple and useful explanation about something. So when you hear theory of relativity, you'd expect to hear what is relativity and how is it important and useful. So the same with theory of constraints. So knowledge of a constraint system is massively useful and important for 5 reasons. How would you set the goal of a company or a system or a person if you don't know what the constraint is, the resource that is limiting you from achieving more? So that's the first thing. Knowing the constraint helps you to set ambitious but realistic goals. The second thing is, if you don't know where the constraint is, like the weakest link in a chain, how do you know where to focus your improvements? You strengthen the weakest link, you make the whole chain stronger. Whether that chain has got 3 links or 300 links, there's still only one weakest link. So for anybody that's interested to find that one thing in their life or in their business to change that will change everything, you need to know where your constraint is. The third thing is, if you're making changes, how do you know how it will impact the whole system? It's a massively complicated problem, even for relatively simple systems. Whether you have a small business or big business, is knowing the impact on a constraint is a good approximation or kind of like a hack to find out what the impact on the whole system is. So that's number 3. So it helps you to set goals, decide where to focus, judge the impact of changes on the whole system. And the last 2 is really interesting. When you're trying to optimize systems, global optimize them, right? Do what's best for the system and not what's best for the parts. Number 4 is, if you know what are the rules to help you to get the most out of your constraint, those same rules help you to maximize the system. And then the last point is, when should you change the rules? When a constraint moves. So if you think about a company like McDonald's, right? Where is their constraint? It's a number of customers walking into a McDonald's restaurant wanting to buy burgers. And as long as that remains their constraint, they can set up standard operating procedures and rules to ensure that they never waste that scarce resource, right? And that's kind of the first step of theory of constraints. Once you've determined what your goal is, your goal determines the resources you need and how many of them you need, right? So if you have a goal of making $1 million, or you have a goal of impacting 1 million people, right? You know what products or services you provide, so it tells you what resources you need and how many of them you need. Any resource that you don't have enough of to achieve that goal is a constraint. And you can only have a few constraints. I don't have enough market demand for my product or service. Right? I have enough demand, but I don't have enough capacity to deliver it. I have enough capacity, I don't have enough supply. I have enough supply, I don't have enough cash. Or lastly, which is my favorite constraint, number 5, is we don't have enough management attention. That's kind of the ultimate constraint for all of us. Whether you're a single mom, right, or the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, the number of things that demand your attention at work and at home will always exceed your available attention. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, a sphere of constraints. It's just a simple explanation about why constraints matter a lot. When you're setting goals, when you're deciding where to focus, when you're trying to judge the impact of changes on the system, we have to figure out what are the rules that we should use. And there's 5 types of constraint: market, capacity, supply, cash, and attention. And that's it. And all of them, identify the constraint, find a way of squeezing more out of it, subordinate everything to that decision. If it's still not enough, then go and get more, hire more salespeople, get another machine, whatever. But then if the constraint moves, go back to step 1. And so it provides you also with a process of ongoing improvement.
So if I can kind of tie that in, you said with McDonald's, for example, their constraint is, how do we get those people through the door, get as much money, so to speak, from them? How do we get them to buy as much as possible? A movement of that constraint would be if there was a beef shortage, for example.
Yes.
And so in real estate, we're kind of going through this shift right now where it was the constraint of how do we actually find a deal that pencils, that we can make enough cash flow from. Now, if there is a deal to be had out there, now it's about getting access to the money. So that would be a change in constraint.
Absolutely. And 2 things happen when the constraint moves. One is the constraint has all the power in the system, right? I remember many years ago, I worked with Cisco Systems. And at that stage, whatever Cisco produced, they could sell. The most valuable company on the planet at that stage. They allowed their suppliers to make 3% margin. Imagine that, right? 3% is nothing.
Yeah.
Any kind of fluctuation in your supply chain, your margin is gone. So guess what happened? Over time, many of these suppliers either went bankrupt or they were acquired. One morning, Cisco wake up asking for another price reduction. They didn't realize that the constraint had moved back to the supply, and they got shown the middle finger, right? So it's like now the constraint is the supply. That's where the power now is. And secondly, you now have to change the rules.
I was just going to ask, do the rules ever change order if the constraint changes?
If the constraint changes, you have to change the rules. So, for example, if you imagine a simple little factory, right? Say that factory is producing these mugs, and it's fortunate, it's done great marketing, and whatever it's producing at the moment, it can sell. So what rules would I use to manage a factory? I would have very long runs producing only one mug of one color. Because every time I change the shape or the color, I have to do a setup, and now I'm losing time and capacity. Why would I? If I could sell everything I could make. But there comes a point where suddenly that doesn't happen anymore. Right? And if I keep on using that same rule to produce one mug in one color, I'm going to be producing stuff, overproduction, that I can't sell. That will just pile up in inventories, consume all my cash. So as soon as the constraint moves into the market, I have to now change the rules of managing my factory to say, now I must shift from selling whatever I've produced to producing only what can be sold.
Is there a way to see those constraints moving before they've moved?
Yeah, it's a very useful way of doing it. Kind of is to think about, if you have a cumulative flow, right? So say you're an aerospace company, you're placing orders on one of your suppliers, and you want to know if the constraint is going to move there, because so many companies today have got supply chain constraints. When do you know that it's starting to happen? So every time you place an order on them, you start graphing it as a cumulative graph, right? And whenever you receive the product from them, you also graph that cumulatively. So if the demand and supply is balanced, these 2 lines should run like this parallel. Make sense?
Yeah.
The horizontal difference between these lines is what's the lead time from you placing the order to getting it. And the vertical difference is your work in process, basically the amount of working capital that's tied up. What happens if these two lines start diverging? Right, so you're placing orders, but this is the shipments that you're getting. It's telling you that they can't cope with the demand. They've become a bottleneck. Now, what will happen if you keep on giving them more orders? Right? You order 100, they only supplied you 50 because they've got a capacity problem. And you now, to get 100, you place an order of 200 on them. You're making the problem much, much worse because they're now producing stuff that's not needed. At the same time, if these things are converging, right, it means that they're running out of demand. They can produce faster than what you're giving them orders. So it's to think about that is that when demand and supply is balanced, which is an ideal system, if you were just graphing, not a normal graph, but cumulative of the demand and supply, it's a very simple way to spot where the bottleneck is in the supply chain. And you can take any value chain and graph the orders that every link in that chain is getting with the supply, and you can very quickly see where the bottleneck is moving to.
So this is probably the reason that I see a lot of people in the real estate world, and they're tracking the days on market, for example, the supply that's on the market, and they're watching those very closely. What would you be watching in the real estate in order to figure out, which direction things were going?
A very simple thing to remember, a backlog means a bottleneck, right? So as soon as you start seeing a backlog developing for people waiting to get homes, it's telling you that suddenly now there's a supply constraint. So they're doing exactly the right thing. If you were monitoring not just basically how long the queue is, but whether the queue is growing. So the time it takes somebody to find a property, that's normally the first kind of red flags that you're starting to have a supply constraint. When those lead times start coming down dramatically, you now realize, okay, there's a demand problem. People are not waiting. There's excess capacity in the market, right? It's very easy to find a home at a reasonable price. So just tracking that is, whenever you see a backlog, it's like a traffic system, right? Yeah. You see a backlog, a long queue, there's a bottleneck.
So if somebody's developing and they're building large multifamily, or they're building maybe self-storage, and they're watching those trends, but it's going to take them maybe 18 months to finish a build, what are the things that you would be looking for as an indicator that they should be building or shouldn't be building in that market?
It's a great question, and that's why time is so important. So the longer it takes me to produce something, right, the longer ahead of time I have to forecast to make sure I'm not over or under supply. And all that we know about forecasts is the further in the future I'm trying to predict what's going to happen, the less accurate it becomes. Right? So there's some practical way that I can reduce or compress the time it takes me to produce anything. It's a massive, massive advantage. There's a great story, 1926, right? Henry Ford, they were producing Model T cars, all black, right? And from my previous story, you know why it's all black and it's only one model, because they could sell whatever they produce. So why switch the model? Why change the color? Black dried the fastest. Their bottleneck was the drying part, right? The paint shop. In 1926, guess what the total lead time was from a ton of iron ore coming out of their mines until that ton of iron ore drove into a dealership as a Model T car. Take a guess, 1926, total lead time. One practical way is just think about all the amount of inventory in number of days that would be sitting at the mine, the stockpile of ore, right? At the steel plant, at the pressing plant, at the assembly plant, etc. What's your guess?
6 months.
I was going to say 4.
That's a really good guess. And we've done work with the ones that are closest to that today that owns that whole supply chain is Tata Steel. They own all the way from the mine to their own dealerships because they produce Tata cars. It's about 6 to 7 months today. 1926, it was 81 hours.
Wow.
Now imagine the competitive advantage that gives you. Sitting with in total 81 hours of working capital, right?
Yeah.
Compared to 6 months. You try to predict what's the demand going to be in 6 months. Who the hell knows? So the same with the property market. So one of the biggest things that we focus on in the property market is how can we dramatically compress the lead times, whether it is about building new stuff or it's about finding and acquiring new stuff. It's every day that you can save, there's a huge cost of a day delay. And once you quantify that, you can quantify that, it tells you how much money is there on the table to find practical ways of compressing that lead time.
So this is the difference between finding a good deal that's already running versus finding something that needs to be remodeled, for example, or even an adaptive reuse where you're taking something that was used for office, for example, and turning it to residential. Anything you can do to shorten that time frame of getting to the market is going to give you better prediction.
Absolutely. And there's kind of two reasons why you end up, sitting with too much stuff. One is because there's long lead time, so it's hard to predict, so you end up overproducing. The other one is where the incentives are not aligned with what's good for the system. So the people are being incentivized for the sake of efficiency. It's like you ask, since 1926, we've learned a little bit about how to manage operations and supply chains, right? So why today is it 6 months of inventory and lead times compared to 81 hours? Well, it's because the steel plant gets incentivized based on the tons per hour that they're producing, not the tons per hour that's being consumed and sold. So as soon as you decouple those two things, you stuck with systems that overproduce or underproduce.
So what were they doing back then to be so efficient, and why has it gone in such the wrong direction?
They had basically what Henry Ford used to call kind of flow managers. And these people had basically just two jobs. Is wherever the flow of that iron ore got stuck, their number one job was to get it unstuck. And then their number two job was to write a procedure to make sure it never gets stuck there again. Mm-hmm. Now, to do that is something that's hard to kind of understand when you're trying to maximize resource utilization. To improve the flow, you don't want the flow, the work that's going through the system, to be waiting for resources. Right? If you think about traffic, right?
Right.
You just want the car to flow at the maximum speed that you can travel. Right? You have a 30 miles to travel, you can travel at 60 miles an hour, it should take you half an hour. Whenever you're waiting for a resource, which is in this case the road, to become available because it's filled up with other stuff, you get delays. The other way of managing the system is work is constantly waiting for the resource, because I'm trying to maximize the utilization of the resource. And there's a very simple example that shows you how the lead time grows exponentially. I hope all the viewers and listeners can associate with it. Say, Julia, I come to you and I say, your job is you do tasks that takes you 1 day, right? That's just your job. And I go, how long will it take you to do this 1 day task? What's your answer?
And I say 1 day.
1 day, right? Yeah. The right answer should be, it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on your current utilization, your current busyness, right? So if you had nothing else on your plate, a 1 day task will take you 1 day. What if you were 50% busy already? It'll take you 2 days.
Right.
What if you 75% busy? Now it takes you 4 days.
Yeah.
What if you're 90% busy? It takes you 10 days. If you're 99% busy, it'll take you 100 days to get to a 1 day task. Can you see the exponential growth of lead time as the busyness of the resource gets close to 100%? There's a sort of magical number of around 80%. Where it's reasonable, right? A 1 day task will take about 5 days to do. But once I get over that, and that happens when I'm trying to maximize the resource utilization. It's like in construction, we have these big pieces of earth moving equipment, right? You're trying to maximize the utilization of those. Guess what happens? All the projects are waiting for that piece of equipment.
What do you see in business? Because most of the people that we work with in real estate that are sponsors, that are syndicators, investors, they wear a lot of hats, and that does tend to make that exponential growth of trying to get things, the time frame of trying to get things done. What are some of the items of advice that you can give to somebody in business so that they can be more concise in the things that they need to get done?
You have to understand what's the avoidable causes of delays, right? So you have unavoidable causes of delays, things that are out of your control that happens. There's a strike at a port in Vietnam and you're bringing in stuff that you can't do much about. But by far the majority of the delays that we see on construction projects are avoidable. And one of the biggest ones are multitasking. Mm-hmm. Where we're trying to do too many things at the same time.
Yeah, and you see a lot of times where an investor maybe really likes to work with one contractor. And so they're trying to get that contractor to work on multiple projects. And if somebody's working on multiple projects, would they be better off to hire, let's say, 3 subpar contractors versus one really great one?
Yeah, I mean, we recently did a little simulation model for a developer. So they developed condos, right? And they came up with this really great way of building a condo from scratch in 120 days. Okay, so I said, so they're just launching this. Right? So they're securing investors, etc. And all the numbers on an Excel spreadsheet, it looks fantastic. Like they're going to make a ton of money. Everybody's going to make money. So they asked us to just check their assumptions. So I said, okay, so tell me how you're planning to do this. And they said, the plan is, we have 5 teams. We're going to give every team 2 condos to work on. I said, okay, what's your logic? I said, well, if one condo is delayed, it's waiting for something, the team can shift to the other condo. So they'll always have something to do. So 5 teams, 10 projects, 10 condos that they're launching in parallel, right? So imagine the project portfolio, there's 10 condos, and they're all planned to finish in 120 days. So we built a simulation model for this. Press the play button. They were hoping to make around, 30% margin on this. Press the play button. All the projects, the fastest one completed in about 160 days, the slowest one in about 300 days because of the multitasking. So then we said, well, what if you just don't do that? What if you just do one at a time? Suddenly you're getting back to the sort of 130, 140 days. And then you say, well, another mistake that we make is we pre-allocate resources ahead of time, right? And once I've allocated it according to the plan, it's stuck there, right? Probably the worst example of this is budgeting. I don't know if you've heard of this thing called spend it or lose it, right? It's very common, especially in the public sector, but even in the private sector, right? People plan a year in advance. They're preparing a budget. Now, how accurate is our forecast for a year of what will actually be demanded of the product or services that my agency or department does? Who the hell knows? Right. But then we make the mistake of locking that in. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So imagine you were frugal right throughout the year. You get to the last few months and you left with some surplus. Now you're stuck in this horrible conflict. If I don't use it, I not only lose it this year, but I'll use it next year. So we built a simulation model, which is one of the common things that we do if you're trying to understand systems, is to build a model and see the dynamics, right? It turns out that government agencies and private sector companies are typically losing between 5 to 10% of their total budget because of spend it or lose it.
Wow. And if there's growth happening within a company and that's going on, then they're really more afraid to lose it in the following year.
Exactly. And it's the same thing that causes, one of the companies that we work with is one of the biggest fashion brands in the world, right? So their equivalent of that is shortages and surpluses at the retail. Why is there shortages and surpluses? Because they are giving the factory an order to produce a specific garment or shoe 6 months ahead of time. Why 6 months? Because the backlog on the factory is about 5.5 months. Only takes them a couple of days to actually produce all the stuff, but you have to wait, right? And it's a vicious cycle now. Now I have to tell them 6 months in advance of that shirt that you're wearing, how many are you going to order? And once you've ordered it, you're stuck with it, right?
Yeah.
If suddenly it becomes massively popular, you might sell that whole 6 months supply in the first month. They think it's a good thing. Oh, we stocked out. Well, you lost 5 months of sales on the highest sales velocity item, right? And the other one where they never sell the 6 months. So now they have to discount it. It occupies space and cash, all the scarce resources. So those are the type of things is what we find is that avoidable delays and avoidable shortages and surpluses are relatively simple problems to fix if you look at the whole system.
And in that scenario, what was the potential fix? Was it to get a new supplier, to add an additional supplier, or something else?
Well, one thing that you have a couple of foundational principles that you'll use. For example, some of them comes from finance, right? So if you think about aggregation, why do we have short-term insurance? Right? Why don't each of us not try to save enough for ourselves? It's because there's a benefit of aggregating, right? And there's a mathematical rule that's very simple. It's basically the root square of the number of things that you combine. So if we can put 9 people together, the root square of 9 is 3. It'll give you an advantage of 3 times over that 9 people trying to protect themselves individually against some kind of catastrophe, whether it's being, robbed or there's some kind of flood, right? So the more things I can aggregate, the better. But what happens in the supply chain like that one, so you place this huge order, right, for 6 months of supply of sneakers or shirts or whatever. It comes into your distribution center. You don't want to sit with all of that working capital. So you push it through to the retailers. And all that you know there is you're going to have too much and too little. The counterintuitive part is let's keep most in the central distribution warehouse where we benefit maximum from aggregation. And how much do I need to give each retailer? Right?
Yeah.
As when you walk into a shop, do you know the average inventory turns that they get? It's like 4 to 6 per year. So they're keeping somewhere between 3 and 4 months of inventory at the shop. And you ask them, how frequently can you get replenished? Every day. It's like, why are you keeping 3 months of stock? So it's those type of things where you always start with, what is the big problem that you see in the industry? There's too much and too little of something, right? Whether it's properties or merchandise or whatever. So, okay, how much of that is avoidable versus unavoidable? And normally the majority is actually avoidable. And then to figure out what are those simple rules that I can change. Don't order 3 months. Just order what you need for the next replenishment period. If you can get it replenished every day or every week, then dramatically cut it.
Yeah.
So besides tracking supply and demand, what are some of the other things we can do to avoid making mistakes?
I think going back to my background as a decision scientist, right? People are often ask me like, what do decision scientists do? They say, well, we have a pretty fun job. The first thing is we try to figure out why good people make and often repeat bad decisions. And so far we found kind of 4 main reasons. And in my research lab, we've tried to develop an app to address each of these reasons. So the first one is we don't realize to what extent our emotions get to evolve. We don't rationalize and then we decide. We don't look objectively at things and then we decide. What we do is we decide based on emotions and then we rationalize. We found ways of justifying so our emotions massively impact decisions and it can cause us to overreact because of an exaggerated frustration with the status quo or an exaggerated expectation. And that's true both for our personal lives and in business, right? You can overreact, ask for a divorce when there's some kind of exaggerated frustration with the status quo. He's not picking up his socks, or some exaggerated expectation of what the future could look like. But we also procrastinate, we underreact. And that's normally because of some exaggerated fear of loss or effort or risk. That's the first mistake. The second mistake of why we make avoidable decision mistakes is we get overwhelmed with complexity and we don't even know where to start, right? So you give somebody an ambitious target, right? And they don't even know where to start. So
Which happens all the time in real estate.
right. So getting them to sort of break it up into parts and say step 1, step 2, step 3, keep it as simple as possible, as few steps as possible. That's the way of dealing with that thing. The third one is that we are often asked to make decisions that are highly subjective. So an objective decision would be one where I can give you the formula, and whether I give you or you the formula, you plug in the numbers and the answer is always the same, right? So highly objective. Subjective is where you have to make a judgment call. And then unfortunately, most real life decisions require judgment calls because of something called VUCA. I don't know if it's a terminology that's understood in the real estate. It essentially comes from the phrase. The acronym VUCA stands for volatility. So there's volatility in demand and supply. The U is for uncertainty. It's always going to be uncertain what the impact will be or what caused something, especially because small things can have big changes, right? Have big impacts, right? So there's uncertainty of causes and effects. The first C is complexity. Things are dependent on each other. Lots of parts and they're interconnected. Like when we're working with retail, and you ask somebody, you're trying to come up with a forecast for this new model, right? You think you're going to sell 1 million. Do you think you should consider how many of the old model is currently available still?
Absolutely.
Yes. Do you think they do? Never. Right?
Because they're excited about the new model.
Yes. So that's kind of what complexity is things are interdependent. It makes it really hard. You can't just look at the part and now make a prediction. You have to look at the whole system. The second C is constraints. You'll always have constraints of demand, supply, capacity, cash, attention, right, that you have to consider. And the last A part of VUCA is ambiguity. There's multiple objectives and they often are competing. So how do I make a decision in a VUCA world, right? Where I have to be effective and efficient. So the only way that we can make decisions there is we use simple heuristics, simple rules of thumb that are not dependent on all that VUCA elements, but it requires intuition. And what happens is that, if you've been doing this for 30 years and you've learned the right lessons, you would develop intuition to be able to help you make those really difficult calls for which there's no formula, right? It's highly subjective. You have to use your gut feel, your intuition. But what we often do is we put people into positions which requires subjectivity and intuition, and I haven't yet developed it. Right? There's a reason why it takes us, 10, 20, 30,000 hours to become an expert at something. So that's that third category of avoidable decision mistakes is when you're trying to make a decision that requires subjectivity and you haven't developed the intuition, phone a friend that has. Right? Daniel Kahneman, one of the most famous decision scientists, he has this lovely, simple criteria to remember. He says, like when you're facing a really difficult decision, who should you phone? Right? So firstly, make sure that they're really an expert, right? Don't go and ask the poor guy about finance because he has no idea, or the friend that's been divorced 4 times about marriage, right? Make sure that they're really an expert. Second criteria, make sure they like you. Third criteria, that they don't like you too much. that they will give you the honest answer,
They can be objective.
that they can be objective, right? So that's kind of the third one. And then the last one, which is an area that we also focus on, is our mind is not very good at dealing with probabilities and interconnectedness, etc. Even the simple little systems, because of the variability and interconnectedness, makes it very hard to predict. So there it's building simulation models. You can't do it with simple Excel spreadsheets. You have to actually build full dynamic simulation models, like that condo example that I mentioned. If you do the Excel calculations, right, it shows you that, oh, you have enough capacity to do all 10 condo projects at the same time and they'll make 30%.
Yeah.
You press the play button, you actually simulate it, showing how often projects are waiting for resources and what happens because the resources are multitasking and task switching. Suddenly everything takes long and you can't get that. So those are a sort of full avoidable decision mistake. It's emotions. It's to do with being overwhelmed. It's to do with the fact that I haven't yet developed the intuition and yet I'm being asked to make decisions that requires that. And the fourth one is just too complex. I need to build simulation models.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm always tying this back to real estate and the idea of what we have. So I think about like mentors, for example. I had a mentor when I was young in the business, and he always told me, never take advice from somebody that you wouldn't trade places with. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of that thought of you have to look for that person. As you've been studying that, do you find that there's a reason why people are unwilling to reach out and ask for that help that they need?
That's a great question. I mean, why don't you ask for help, right? So what we normally ask is, pick an example where you haven't asked for help when you needed help. So start with that, right? It's like, why wouldn't you ask for help? So try to answer that question yourself.
So I can see, like, sometimes if I, in an example for me, where I was having a really difficult time in business, I thought people would essentially look at me as a threat, so to speak, to their business, because their business was dependent on mine. So how could I reach out to them when I was struggling myself?
So that's a great and very common reason. Another one is that, imagine I'm new in this, right? And I'm trying to portray myself as an expert, as somebody that knows what the hell I'm doing. What does it tell people and myself when I have to ask for help, right? It makes me feel, number one, and look like I'm not really an expert. But when you look at the true experts, they instantly know that this is an area that they don't have much intuition about, and they will phone somebody. Like you see it very often in the legal system, as the judges are constantly phoning each other. You know, there's a case that, like sex trafficking, that maybe that judge has never seen before, right? He's been sitting on the bench for 30 years. He wouldn't hesitate a second to phone a judge that deals with those cases all the time. So when you have that embarrassment, it's a big, big problem. And I heard Steve Jobs talk about, you know, one of his inspirational videos. And he said one of the biggest lessons he learned was, as he was growing up, he would not hesitate to ask for help. He said the people that really are experts always are very gracious with their time and expertise. It's the ones that are not that you have to put a question mark whether they're really an expert.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
I think one other aspect to that too is that there could be a small part of you that doesn't really want to know the truth. Maybe you want it to be a positive answer, but it's not. So how do we come back and run that through the mental part of decision making?
That's such a brilliant point. If you think about being an entrepreneur that's developed this new product, or you've got a new development, right? My wife is currently in the process. She's building a golf performance institute, right? She's a golfer, and she's been traveling around like crazy for all the things like going practice here, get physio there, go to gym there. So she has this idea of putting everything under one roof, right? And every time she's asking people, what do you think about this idea? What do you think the feedback is?
They love it.
Fantastic idea. So she said, you know, do you have any advice? I said, you have to find people that will tell you what they don't like about the idea. But as the inventor, we don't want to hear it, right? So when we work with entrepreneurs, if they develop some new product, it's like design an experiment to check. And they always find excuses not to do it because they don't want to know. It's a hard thing to overcome, but you have to overcome it. So one of the biggest research projects that we've got in our lab is we realize that people don't learn from experience. We learn from experiments, right? So whether it's doing a new development, you are very likely to repeat the mistakes that you've made on the first one, unless you viewed it as an experiment. And when we view things as experiment, we list down what's the assumptions here, right? The assumption is that I can build this in 120 days. I can sell it for this price. This will be my cost. That will be my margin. These are all assumptions. So now I'm thinking, what's the fastest way to check if that's true? So going back to the idea of theory of constraints, how does it all tie back? Theory of constraints can basically be summarized in 3 words. It's focus. Focus on the constraint in the system. Improve that and you improve the whole system. But the second part is fast feedback. Is you have to constantly design small experiments to get fast feedback about what's working and what's not working. And what's not working, try to find a way of improving it or stop it. What is working, double down on it. But what we end up doing is we end up spreading our resources too thin, trying to do too many things all at the same time. It's like we have the ability to learn from experience like this, as long as there's fast feedback. Think about touching a stove plate, right? How many times do you need to touch it to learn? Once, right? Maybe unless you're my boys, I somehow need to, right? But imagine it burnt you just a day later.
Yeah.
How long will it take you now to put those two things together, right? And that's the practical difficulty that we have in real life, is that there's lags in time and space between causes and effects. So unless you think of every decision you make as an experiment, you're probably not going to learn from it, and you'll probably repeat the same mistakes again.
So is there a formula when you're starting out a new project, for example, and probably ending a project? You might want to do it in both cases. Are there formulas there to have a better impact with your decision making?
I think that the simplest criteria to apply for any decision, but that's really complicated, is that we need to try to think about a decision as benefit versus cost, right? So if the benefit is more than the cost, it's a good decision. But that requires us to predict what the likely benefit will be and the likely cost. So on that condo project, they calculated their margin to be 30% based on the likely benefits and the likely cost. But we suck at estimating the likely number of anything. Mm-hmm. What we are pretty good at is predicting the best case and worst case. And for many decisions, practically, that's the only thing I need. So I talk about how yes and how no decisions, right? So think about this. If the worst case benefit is still greater than the worst case cost, is that an easy decision?
Seems like it, yeah.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. And there's a range between the best case and the worst case for the cost, and the range between the best case and the worst case for the benefit. If the worst case benefit is still greater than the worst case cost, no brainer, hell yes decision.
Yeah.
What if it's not? It's to think about, how can I increase the worst case benefit and how can I decrease the worst case cost? So practically, that's kind of a framework that I use. You think about people that are in options trading, right? They know for them to be successful, they basically need 3 criteria. One is they need enough options that has asymmetry in their favor, right? Bigger upside, small downside. Secondly, they need a simple way of deciding which options to exercise and which ones to let go. And if you apply the same kind of principle to your own life or your to business to say, an option is like a change you can make in your business or your life. Make those changes. It has a big upside if it works and a small downside if it doesn't. That's a hell yes decision. A hell no decision, small upside if it actually works, huge downside if it doesn't, right? Yeah. You think about like having an affair. Hell no decision. Small upside if it's actually working, huge downside if it doesn't. So that's kind of a way for the audience to think about it, is having these very simple rules that you can use to make these very, very complex decisions.
So how do we get those emotions out of the way? I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm imagining my career helping people learn fix and flip real estate, for example. When you do the numbers, I always tell them, look at the worst case scenario. What is the most you'll pay for the money? What is the most you're going to pay for that remodel, in your mind? And, what's the upside? And if everything looks good in a worst case scenario, it's even better in a best case scenario.
Right.
But oftentimes we still take that worst case scenario and we're probably a little bit more lenient on it than we could be. How do we step aside from that and make sure we're looking at an actual worst case scenario?
I think the first thing is to teach people about that reality, right? We all suffer from confirmation bias. Like I said, is when we make a decision, we don't look objectively at all the facts, rationalize it, and then we make a decision. We decide and then we rationalize. But practically what happens is, as soon as I've made a decision that this flip is a good deal, guess what my mind does?
It starts rationalizing why it is.
It's only seeing evidence to support my decision. It doesn't matter how experienced I am, it's actually blocking out all the data because it's too traumatic, right? So let's say put some filters. I will identify those people to go and talk to that will confirm my decision. Like, what do you think? Oh, I think it's a great idea. Well, everybody else started. No, it's a fantastic idea, right? So you put up those folders. It's actually a hard work to challenge your assumptions. You have to make an effort, right? And one practical way of doing it is list all the assumptions. Like I said, treat every decision as an experiment to learn from. First step is, what's my assumptions here? And then see if there's simple ways to go test those assumptions before I fully commit. Get that fast feedback. And part of it is to actually go to talk to people that don't like the idea, that this will disagree with you.
Makes sense. So you take your time before you make a decision. Because I'm listening to you and I'm laughing in my head of all the people that have come to me for advice, and you start telling them something that is contrary to what they're thinking, and they completely disregard it, and they'll even argue, even though they were asking you for the advice, and then they'll go find other people that will confirm their decision that they've already made.
And it's amazing how we suffer from it. So, I was dealing with a guy the other day. It's like one of the most sexist guys I've worked with in my life, right? So the company board hired me to kind of coach the guy through a brilliant mind, but it's like, worst guy ever, right? So it's like, why don't you like women? Like, list all the reasons. Says they can't bloody drive. First thing, can't drive. So I said, can you give me an example this morning on your way to work that proves to you that women can't drive? So of course they always have an example. Those women that cut in front of them. I said, okay, on the way to work, that 45 minutes, how many female drivers did you pass? This is like hundreds. Okay, so, and they were all following the rules. They drove pretty well. Yeah. But you see what his mind does. He uses the one to justify the rule. Mm-hmm. Right? So unless you have that kind of smarts about you to say, let me try to look objective at this thing. It's 1 out of 100 or 1,000. Does that support my conclusion that people are like that? No, it doesn't. But unfortunately, that's what our mind does. Our mind is trying to protect our ego, right? So once we make a decision, that's all that we pay attention to, is finding evidence to support our decision.
Yeah, we'll always find what we're looking for.
We always find what we're looking for, and it's true for your personal life, but also for business. So the advice is always treat every decision as an experiment to learn from.
And is So I would love to understand that more. For somebody who is not a research scientist or a decision scientist or any scientist, we don't really understand how to do a proper experiment. So what are the steps in order to consider something an experiment as you're going into the decision-making process?
So the first thing is think of every decision as an experiment. That's just step number one. Step number two says, okay, to make it a good experiment, I need to know what's my assumptions. Like say you're starting a new exercise program, right? And you've decided, okay, enough is enough. I'm looking at myself in the mirror. Oh my God, I can't stand it. Okay, I need to do something. Go on a diet, do some exercise. Okay, treat it as an experiment. Now the next question is, what's the assumptions that I've made? And how can I get fast feedback about whether this assumption is true or not? So that's the second part of a good experiment, is I need a way of getting fast feedback. The third part of a good experiment is full compliance to whatever I decided to do, right? Yeah. Because if I don't quite follow the diet and I don't get the result that I'm expecting, I will never know.
Yeah.
Right? Is it the diet that's not working, or is it my non-compliance? And it's amazing to see in organizations how they tolerate non-compliance. We have a standard operating procedure, we have a standard policy, but as long as you're achieving your results, you can do what you want. But now I don't know, is it because of your genius or is it because of the policy, right? I want to know that the policy is working. So that's a third part of a good experiment, is that there's full compliance, at least for the time period of the experiment. That's how we learn from experiments, not from experience.
I'm starting to really see that the experiments and having full compliance relate so much to what you talk about when you talk about goals. And you say, don't make a 10% goal, make a 10x goal.
Yes.
And without those hell yeses or hell no's or full compliance, you're never going to get 10x. So I would like to transition a little bit into how do you achieve those impossible goals that you talk about?
So something that I've always been passionate about is how do you achieve impossible goals? How do you make impossible decisions? And you think about, why would I call something impossible? If it's an impossible goal, it means that there's some conditions that I think are out of my control that will limit me, some constraint or obstacle that's out of my control that I can't achieve. So I try to make realistic goals. It's like I have a 10% target, not a 10x target, right? I was recently at an interview, asked, somebody gave the audience this little exercise to say, think about at least 3 ways to improve your business by 10%, right? And everybody got going, etc. And they turned to me and they said, Alan, what do you think about my question and exercise? I said, I think it's terrible. I said, why would it be terrible? I said, how many ways are there to improve something by 10%?
Countless.
Almost countless, right? So if you're trying to find out what to focus on, what's the one thing that can change everything, that exercise will take you in the wrong direction. What would be a better question? Find at least 1 or 2 things that can improve you by 10x.
Did you contribute to that book by chance? X is equal to 2x. I just finished it recently.
Yeah. So Dr. Benjamin Hardy wrote that book, and he told me one of the inspirations was me challenging.
I remember the story when you were saying
that. And so you think about that. So what's the benefit of 10x, right? As firstly, how many ways are there to improve anything by 10x? Very, very few, maybe even 1. So when we need to focus, because there's so many things, so many opportunities, so little attention, right? So little budget, it will help us to find that one thing or the 2 things that can make all the difference. That's an absolutely critical thing. The second part is, okay, but what if I make the target so ambitious that I'm now considering it to be impossible? Right? So someone might say, okay, 10x, okay, but that's just impossible. What do you do? And it took me a long time to discover this. But in psychology, there's this concept called the disruptive question, right? So our mind is in automatic mode, right? So most of our decisions are in automatic mode, by far the majority. A disruptive question disrupts that pattern, makes you think, go back to your, rather than your, fast and automatic mode of thinking, it goes back to your more slow, deliberate cognition, and you have to slow yourself down. It's like, you probably had it, it's like somebody tells you, oh, how amazing their life is, and they're doing this and this and this, and you go, how's that working out for you? You've heard of people ask that, right? Mm-hmm. And it often brings them to a pause, right? Because their life is a mess. But they keep on telling you how brilliant what they're doing, and I'm investing in this, and it's like, how's that working out for you? That's a disruptive question. When it comes to setting goals for yourself and you say a goal is impossible, the disruptive question, it's impossible unless, right? We say something is impossible as a protection mechanism. It means that not only we won't even try it, but we won't even try to think about trying it. As soon as I ask you it's impossible unless, the mind is forced back into problem-solving mode. Because now I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you all the conditions, right? But those conditions are the conditions that if you could put them in place, can make the impossible possible.
That's incredible.
And the same thing with decisions, right? It's an impossible decision. Why? Not because I can't make it, right? Think about the little kid. They're getting bullied. What do I do? Like, do I fight back? Do I tell the teacher? Do I tell my parent? Do I just take it? What's the best decision? It's an impossible decision because every option has got a pros and cons, right?
Yeah.
So how the hell do I make that decision? You ask them, it's impossible unless. It's impossible to make that decision unless I can come up with an option that has a big upside and a small downside.
So this is actually a great transition to talk about PreiShare and what we're doing, because I believe that we are creating that impossible unless, yes, which is if an investor was going out there and they're creating an investment, which is a syndication, which means you're pooling money together. If you don't have enough money yourself, you need to pull others in. And typically you may go out there and pitch, 100 to get to get 3, I should say. 70 people choose not to invest. And typically in real estate, the biggest concern is it's an illiquid investment. You're investing in something that is 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road before you see that return. And a lot of people just don't have that time to wait. And so we're creating a secondary marketplace for those fractional shares, because why do they been illiquid? Not because it has to be, but because the syndicators have made it that way.
Right.
When you're buying into a syndication, you're not buying a piece of real estate. You're buying a fraction of a company that owns a piece of real estate. And so that is therefore a security that could be easily traded. You were talking about options trading earlier. It kind of ties into that same scenario. And now all of a sudden we've opened up a bigger portion of those investors that would invest with that same syndicator. The other thing it does is it gives them more investors that will ultimately get into their transactions simply by the fact that later, after they've already done their raise, they're usually not talking to investors about that deal anymore. But if somebody else decides to sell, they now have a brand new investor that wants to be in their deal, and the person who wanted out for one reason or another gets to move on and do something else with their money. So we believe that this is going to change the industry in giving syndicators the ability to get more investors overall. And on top of that, it's going to build probably a scenario where when you think about the long-term effects, they're not going to have to give such a high rate of return. One thing about real estate is we're usually offering these enormous rates of return compared to the traditional market because we know that those people are going to be in an illiquid scenario and they need a higher rate of return to commit to that. That's kind of the overall theory of PreiShare and what we're doing.
I think ties in directly with the kind of the principles that we've discovered, right? When you think about the high margin, so when we are working with a client in retail, right, and some of the very high fashion brands, you know the kind of margins, right? So you're working with one of the biggest fashion brands at the moment, a handbag of $3,000. Do you know what the actual cost is?
I'm going to guess $3.
A little bit more than $3, like between $30 and $100 is typically, right? And you go, oh, how greedy they are. Well, that margin is required because of the inefficiency in that supply chain to be able to predict what will sell. So they're sitting with stock that sits there for a long time before it doesn't sell. And I think it's the same thing with what you were speaking about is part of it is understanding who's your dream customer. Who will benefit the most from the product or service that you sell? You know, when you wake up in the morning, you wake up to serve somebody, right? Who is that perfect customer? And then for me, the difference between the product and service that you provide and the offer, right, is the offer addresses all the reasons why your dream customer wouldn't buy. And it sounds like that's kind of something that you are systematically doing, right?
Yeah.
Identifying that dream customer and say, why wouldn't you invest? Because I don't want to be stuck with something I can't get out. Okay, what if we solve that problem for you?
Yeah. And the other side of it is some of those people won't invest because they don't want to base their investment on pro forma. So now when it can be traded later term, they have a shorter investment cycle and they have the predictability of saying, I can look at the trailing 12 months maybe, or even 24 months of how it's been performing, and they'll probably pay more for that investment or take less of a return, however you want to look at it, based on the surety that they already know how it's performed.
Absolutely. And I think that is it's not just real estate, right? It goes for everything. It's that ability to design little experiments so you can find out what's the main reason why they're not buying your amazing product or service, and then thinking about a way of addressing that. One of the first times that I got involved in real estate, and I know nothing about real estate, was in Japan, working with one of the biggest home developers in Japan, Daiwa House. And they said, Dr. Barnard, would you come in and help our sales team sell more houses? Like, I don't know anything about selling houses, never mind selling houses in Japan. And it's like, you always ask some kind of question that helps. So, okay, I'll go there. So the whole sales team is sitting there. I say, okay, who sells the most houses here? So they translate and this little guy walks up. He sells the most houses. I said, I want to understand how much more do you sell than the average salesperson? It's like 4 times as much. I said, okay, to the other people, why do you think he sells so much more than you? Oh, he's just lucky, he's got an easy region, there's no competition, etc. So I said to the person, why do you sell so much more? And by the way, whenever you're trying to think about how much is it possible to improve any system, a very generic way of thinking about it is look at the gap between the best and the rest. Because the best is achieving their performance with the current resources, right? So it's like comparing the best day of a factory versus the average day. Why can't we have the best day every day? What are those conditions? So I said to this guy, well, why do you sell more? He says, nobody's ever asked him. He's been there 20 years.
Wow.
Why don't? So I said, so tell me. He says, well, when he's meeting with the family, right? And he asked them, what do you want in this new home that you want us to build for you? And they all have their requirements. He says he does something very simple. He asks each member of the family to give their must-haves and the nice-to-haves. And then he gives them 2 quotes. Everybody else gives them 1 quote. And that quote is always going to be too high or too low. He almost always wins the deal. Because when they compare him, his must-have quotes will be comparable to the lowest quote they would have received. And then a nice to have, they can say, okay, if you have a birth surplus, if you can afford more than $1 million, what is the must-have that dad must have? What's the must-have that mom must have? What is the must-have that little Susie and little Johnny must have? And it's that kind of mindset is just put yourself in their shoes, try to figure out why wouldn't they buy? Why wouldn't they invest in this amazing product or service and addressing that in the offer?
Such a great thing for us to remember in real estate when it comes to what properties to invest, or if you are flipping a house, or what must people have, and then put some bells.
But it's also, going back to a point that you made earlier, is being really honest with yourself. Are the 100 people that I'm trying to sell this really all my dream customers? Right?
Yeah, probably not.
Probably not. And now I'm wasting all my time trying to sell something to somebody that doesn't want it or need it. That's a hard problem to solve. Even if you're the best salesperson in the world, then you have to come up with ways of, you essentially end up being manipulative to get them to buy. So the starting point is always, who is your dream customer? Where are they? How can I find it? What would be the reasons they are not buying it? Seeing how you can address that.
When Michael Anderson sat down and kind of looked at the premise of what PreiShare would be, he did a little reverse engineering. It was kind of like, here's all the pitfalls of sponsorship. This is why it stinks, But then he said, but on the investor side, this is what would make investing so beautiful. And he brought those together to where there really isn't a margin. There's full transparency, and they work together. So I think that's why we're so excited to bring some of these things to the market.
And markets reward win-win-wins, As I can get away today with the win-lose. I win and the customer lose, but it's not sustainable. So coming up with those paradigm shifting offers that you can make that are truly win-wins for the right customer is an amazing way to build your business. They're not easy, but nothing that's worthwhile is ever easy.
And that's what we're finding out. This hasn't been easy to make this shift. And we're just getting to the scenario of even trying to educate the public on what we're doing and how they can now get access to it. Because our customer oftentimes doesn't call themselves anything specific. If you think about a passive investor,
right,
that would be selling or sometimes buying those fractional shares, it's a doctor or an attorney or a professional of some sort that happens to be an accredited investor and then decided to invest in real estate. And now we have to go find those individuals and show them there's a different path.
And I think part of it is also to have confidence in the long-term view, right? There's a lot of volatility and fluctuation in the short term. But one of the examples I often give is, you think about the population growth, right? When you stand back and you look at the population growth over a 200, 500-year period, even a 20, 30-year period, what you see is not a linear curve, is you see an exponential curve, right? Even though the average population growth is like 1.5% or 2%, because it's cumulative, it's compound, you get that exponential growth. And everybody in finance kind of knows the rule of 72, or even simpler, the rule of 70, right? There's 2% growth per year. What's my doubling time? 70 divided by 2 is 35 years. But what I don't think people really understand properly is, what does that mean from a market demand perspective? So if you think about doubling time, if I'm doubling and I'm going from 1 to 2 to 4, the doubling time is the time it takes to double, right? What's very interesting is 8 is 1 more than 1 plus 2 plus 4. And 16 is 1 more than 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8. So what does that mean? If we transcribe it back to building houses, if we have a population growth of 2%, right? Just to keep the numbers round, right? So we have a doubling time of about 35 years. When we think about urbanization, the urbanization rate is about 8%. In some cities, it's 10%. Suddenly now my doubling time could be as little as 7 years. That little mathematical rule I gave you today, what it means is, in the next doubling, I'll have to produce more than what I've produced since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
Right? I'll have to build more houses in the next 35 years than what I've produced since we started civilization. Now, if that doesn't give you chills, nothing will. And it goes for everything that humans consume.
Yeah.
Right.
So this ties into two directions that I want to go, and you can pick which one. So first of all, you're talking about one of our fund principles as well for our fund investors. Essentially, the thought is, if I offered you, you're going to give me $10 for lunch today, and I'm going to give you $20 in a month from now, or I can give you $12 tomorrow. Which one do you choose? And most people will say, I'm going to take that $20. That's what's been done in real estate for so long. I'm going to wait 10 years for that $20. Whereas if that person chooses the $12 option, and then they realize I could find somebody else to lend that $10 to for next month and the following month.
Yes.
And then if you go even beyond that and you say, once I get to the point where I have $20, I could actually loan it out to two people in the same month, and so on and so forth. That's kind of the idea of our short cycle investing, is we want to be in for a very short period of time, capture those multiples, even if it's less than what we would get in the long term. By having a high deal flow, we can give a great return to our fund investors. So that's one idea I thought of. The other thought that I really wanted to ask you, since I've started watching some of your videos, is how do we ever catch up with the demand? When we're in a scenario with real estate, for example, 2007, 2008, all of a sudden the access to money became very limited. And so we didn't build for almost a decade. When you compare the amount of building that we did compared to a normal year, and we've never caught up with that demand. And we're in a situation now where money is, again, getting more expensive and harder to get. How do we ever catch up in the US with the demand for housing?
It's a great question. One of my first big discoveries was, when you think about prosperity for all, where does it come from? And people automatically default to growth. But it doesn't come from growth, it comes from surplus. I need to find a way of generating surplus, right? And going back to, if I don't have enough of a specific resource, my first reaction is to get more, right? There's not enough money, let's print more money. Not enough houses, let's build more houses, right? Let's always get more first. What I should do as step number one is, how do I stop wasting what I've got? Right. And that's a short-term way to solve that problem, is to really look at what we have and see, is there a way that we can stop wasting what we have to generate that kind of capacity? I use it all the time as, working with an organization, and I was working with a mine, right? And I have this goal to achieve 12 million tons a year, right? Okay. And in month 4, they're falling behind. They only had 3 million tons. Now they need to catch up. How the hell do you catch up? They don't have any, they're not making money, they're losing money, so there's no budget to get more resources, right? So imagine yourself, where do you start with a system like this, where they've fallen so far behind that it looks unrealistic that they could ever catch up? And they knew that, right? If they kept on producing at that level, they'll finish at 9 million rather than at 12 million. People will be fired. They won't meet contracts. It will just be a disaster. So at that stage, I don't know much about mining. But what I did know is people waste scarce resources. And in business, the biggest, scarcest resources is management attention and budget. So what I did was I said, okay, I want you to write down on a piece of flip chart, what is it that's currently consuming your attention and budget? All the change initiatives in the organization. When I got to 100, I stopped there. I said, okay, now I'm going to ask you a really tough question. We just agreed that the number one problem is to get more tons. You have to catch up. If you can't catch up, nothing else matters. So I want to go in. I want you to go back to those 100 things and tell me how many more tons they will give you. Each of those 100 initiatives is consuming your scarcest resources, attention and budget. There were 3 out of the 100 that actually would make a difference in the tons. So first step was, what can we stop doing? Right? So the same thing is whether it's a housing crisis, And there's a number of these things that are, because of the population, it's unrelentless. That exponential growing curve doesn't wait for anybody, right? And when you get to that final point where it's starting to grow like this, it goes very, very fast. And you need somebody that can come in that reminds everybody what's the goal, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then evaluate everything that's consuming scarce resources against that goal. And they stop everything that's not directly contributing it. The example I often give, to just put it into perspective, is to say that if you have a bottle and you put a bacteria in that's doubling every minute, right? In 60 minutes, it will fill out the bottle. How full is the bottle at time 59? It's only half, right? At time 58, it's 25% full. Time 57, it's 12.5% full. And that's the problem with the exponential function. Is people in leadership positions think we have time. Let's wait for the next administration to do it. Let's wait for the next cycle to do it, right? It catches you out, and then you don't have time to catch up anymore. But how do you catch up? Is you need to solve a lot of things. Most things you need to stop and then think about, how do I get more out of what I had? How do I focus those few things? And then there's practical things, right? There's an example that was done in the Habitat for Humanity about how long should it take you to build a 3-bedroom house? What do you think?
6 months.
Look, empty lot until the family can move in, and the inspector signs off that it's safe for family to move in.
You have all the resources ready to go?
Yeah, so the goal is to try and do that as quickly as possible, right? To say the goal is to try and put that family, because they don't have housing, how to put them in a house. Current world record is 3 hours and 18 minutes or something, right? But it forces you to think in that 10x mode. Like, how do I reduce it? The time, if it's 6 months, how do I get it done by 10x? Right? As that forces you to go and think about what is actually causing the total lead time to be that long. It's essentially that project waiting for resources. So what if it never had to wait for resources? How fast could you do it? And it's basically stopping that multitasking. So there, from a fear of constraints perspective, going back there, that's something that we're really good at doing, is we found all these reasons why people waste resources, why they lose capacity, why they lose time. And there's normally very simple, eloquent solutions to dramatically compress the lead time and dramatically increase the throughput without adding more, buying more resources.
Yeah. On a private sector, somebody that's wanting to go out there and help solve this problem of the inefficiencies, where would you focus your time, or where would you advise somebody focuses their time? If they can target any real estate sector, where would they go?
I think what you see across the world, and again, I'm not an expert, but just a little bit of research that you do, is you find that every economy, whether it's a developing economy or undeveloped economy, there's a housing crisis in a specific segment of the market, right? It's that low to middle income sector. There's never enough of those, and there's a shortage everywhere. And it's like, how do I fix that problem? Right? Yes, there's land is scarce. So the first thing is, how do I not waste it? Right? I can build apartment buildings. That's one way of doing it. Or I can put these little micro houses, right? So companies like Basketball, I was in their factory the other day, they are trying to solve that problem. I think it's once you realize how big this crisis is going to be, there's a shortage that will just keep on growing. I mean, I asked the team from Basketball, they're currently doing something like 20 houses or something per week in their factory. I said, what's your backlog? Do you know what their backlog is?
Probably huge.
170,000 orders.
Ouch.
It's like, how long is it going to take you to catch up? So what they're doing is they're busy building a mega factory similar to what Tesla has done, because you'd have to produce it at that level to not just catch up, but then to stay ahead of the time. And I think it's that 10x type of thinking that's absolutely required to say there's currently a huge mismatch between demand and supply. What's the simplest, fastest, lowest cost, lowest risk way of closing that gap and keeping it closed?
Yeah. And I guess the other side of that is also meeting a demand that people are going to go for, right? So I think about Neil Bawa, who we've had on the show. His goal is to focus on getting 10,000 townhomes, because he believes that people that want to live in a house, but they are in that, lower to middle price point, that can't afford a house will live in a townhome, little postage stamp backyard, and a little porch out front. They still feel like they're in their own home, but you can fit a lot more townhomes, for example, on a plot of land than if you're building a single family home.
Yeah, and even it feels like it's something that's very uncomfortable, but people in Europe have been doing it for ages, right? The travelers have been doing it where we basically sleep in bunk beds, right? And we have a big space, communal space, and at night the bedroom is really just for sleeping, and you have a little capsule that you zip up to give you some privacy. But it's that type of thinking that will be required to solve it. The problem is just going to get worse and much worse and very quickly if people are not thinking at that 10x level.
Well, and cities and communities know that's coming. There's already incentives for that type of housing, and they're making it easier and easier for builders and, syndicators to come in and make transitions, make remodels.
Right. It's the same with cars, right? We already have too little road capacity, right? So already traffic jams. So what do? So, how do I get fewer cars on the road? At the moment, the efficiency of a car is terrible. Like, what percentage of time do you actually use your car? Right? And the percentage if you use it, how frequently are you the only person in the car? Right? Yeah. So it's those type of things that you really have to think about. But sometimes, I remember I was at a conference and one of the big consulting companies were up there, and they said that they received a ton of money to go and do research about the impact that ride sharing and autonomous cars will have on the congestion on the roads, right? And I said, this is, anybody can guess in the audience about what the combination of those two things will do on the congestion on the road. By what percentage will it reduce congestion? I had a bit of an unfair advantage because we built simulation models of traffic, right? So I put up my hand that I said, it's going to increase the congestion. The guy said, it took them 2 years to figure this out. Like, how do I know, right? We think just logically is when you have ride share, right, and there's a lot of competition, it becomes more affordable. So what will happen to people that are currently taking a bus or a train? I'd much rather take a car, right? So I'm moving traffic from those networks back onto the road. And the same with autonomous cars, right? Now they don't go to sleep. They stay on the road. So the number of cars is going to increase from both of those perspectives. Of course, it will help with parking, and there's a couple of other benefits there, but it's really thinking about what will be the real impact, and is it going to be the saving grace, or do we need another breakthrough here to really solve that problem?
Yeah. I think about when you talk about infrastructure, we have a huge airport infrastructure project going on right now. They say it's 10 years to finish, but by the time the 10 years gets there, it's already inefficient for that current demand.
Exactly. It's like many years ago, I was working with a Dubai airport, right? And they were reporting growth rates of passengers going through the airport at about 10% per year. So going back to our doubling time story, right? 7 years to double. But what it also means, in the next 7 years, they'll have more passengers going through the airport than all the passengers that have gone through that airport since they've opened. And I had people don't click, right? And they go, we have a huge problem here.
Yeah, this is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
what types of things do you think we need to be doing in real estate to combat some of this?
I think being a company that clearly wants to make money and make money for the investors, but are also socially responsible. I think if there's a way of matching those two things, that would be groundbreaking. There's real crisis in low-cost housing around the world. There's other infrastructure issues as well, that there's a real crisis. Like we were working a little while ago with the agency in the Netherlands that's looking at bridge repair, right? And when I came to me, I asked him some numbers. Just to make sure that these bridges don't go over the time for which the certificates have been signed that they're still safe, it would mean that they would have to do repairs at a rate of about 3 to 5 times their best year ever. And I said, what's happening with your budget? Oh, every year our budget is being cut. Right? Now you think about that. In Netherlands, what happens if they close a bridge? Sometimes it's the only way to get to your home because of all the water is on this one bridge. Now it has to be closer because it's unsafe, right? So those things, so anything related to infrastructure and housing, etc., I think when the demand is exceeding the supply, there's a huge potential for profit. But you want to be responsible, right? You want to limit it because you could exploit it very easily. So you want to be responsible, make enough money for the investors and yourself, but at the same time contribute massively to a global problem.
And I think this is something that we can look at for our criteria for the approved sponsors that the fund may invest with, is that social aspect of it.
Agreed.
Everything that we're talking about right now, one of the biggest constraints, I believe, in somebody going out there and doing these big developments to house more people is the access to money. That's the biggest constraint we have. And I believe what we're doing with PreiShare is going to relieve that for a lot of people. It'll give them access to money that they wouldn't otherwise have in a faster time frame.
Right. And then, again, thinking long-term, which I know is what your team is constantly doing, is then to say, okay, once we've overcome the money constraint, where will the constraint move to next?
Because it will happen.
And because it will, right? The constraint always moves, and then the rules will have to change. Right. I can say, and it's normally not that difficult to just think about it. Like practically, where will it move to? Right? What will now become the limiting factor? Okay, now how can we start putting together the building blocks so we're ready when that happens?
Yeah. So when we've already supplied the money, what would we want to be supplying next?
Exactly. And that's where you really build up leverage, right? Is where you start off, you penetrating the market, you're very successful, you're starting to dominate. It might be a very small niche, but then you say, what else do they need? Right? Because you now already build trust with them.
There's so much to remember here to not stay complacent and to keep tracking and to keep watching our careers and our investments as experiments.
Yeah.
It's a little bit mind-blowing.
I could probably sit here all day long and continue to have this conversation. I know we want to be respectful of your time. Dr. Alan, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the great questions from both of you. It was an absolute joy to answer as many as I could.
Great. Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us for another edition of the Fundication Show. Make sure that you go back and look at all of our other social media. And if you are wanting to sell your fractional share, go to PreiShare.com/listing hub.
Thanks, everybody.